Hi, everybody. Welcome to the farm. Today I'm joined by Stephen Snider and Colin Reid for a show about magic, popular music, and fiction, and the hypersigils that hyperlink these ideas in our modern information overload culture. The Babylon working brought forth a proper witch to fill the archetypal shoes of the whore of Babylon. This working is central to UFO lore, the explosive birth of the atomic age, and a signal of our military industrial strength among other things, but it is also central to Morrison's massive hypersigil about hypersigils, the Invisibles graphic novel. Morrison sees himself as a kind of great value comic book prophet, following in the godfather Alan Moore's footsteps in magic and molding of all comic book mythology. Like Jack Parsons, who attracted one Marjorie Cameron to his doorstep, Morrison created a similar reality, first in his graphic novel in the form of Ragged Robin, then in his real life. Pretty soon, too many red-headed Babylonian women showed up, and too many to know what to do with. The redhead magic woman archetype follows suit with Jean Grey. Her name even means gray alien genes to me, and Wolvie calls her Jeannie, as in a genie or I dream of. But Scully is another red-headed woman with alien genetics. Red-headed women of Irish and Native American heritage are the most abducted demographic worldwide by far. Jean Grey even invokes a space god and is worshipped and stalked by a black magic cult once home to Thomas Jefferson, the Hellfire Club. In First Class, the Hellfire Club is even depicted with Azazel the Demon as a primary member. What Philip K. Dick called Valis and John Lilly called Echo, it seems Grant Morrison deems Barbalith. What PKD called the Black Iron Prison, Grant simply refers to as the outer church or archons in Invisibles, and more akin to the Echo or Earth Coincidence Control Office from Lilly's theories. In Grant's similar villain, is Grant's similar villain from Seven Soldiers, the Tailors of Time, who are conveniently similar to the Dark City's Strangers. Around the time that Lilly and PKD were coming to terms with these ideas, even David Bowie was telling interviewers he could draw a door into another world with a crayon and really enter into another world while doing photo shoots with marbles laid out in the Sephiroth design. It becomes even more interesting when art, which was created at a conscious level, begins to include a very direct magical education. These hypersigils began after 1999 when films like The Matrix had us viewing reality in a very different way. Most importantly, our popular culture was inspiring us to understand our reality as malleable and our consciousness as the tool which can mold this reality. This is most clearly written into the lyrics of Tool's Lateralis album, certainly not the first concept album to touch on these kinds of ideas, but also Moore's Prometheus and of Promethea, rather, and of course Invisibles itself, which includes historical landmarks in consciousness, like Oppenheimer testing the atom bomb, and other events going back and forward in time. Promethea, like Maynard in his Lateralis lyrics, actually climbed the Sephiroth itself, and explains the process to the reader or listener directly. Grant released Invisibles as one act of magic, but then explained the entire process and beckoned the crowd at one disinformation lecture to follow his directions, act on all the knowledge we collect intellectually from people like McKenna or Robert Ann Wilson. He pushes us to get up and do something magical. The way he proved magic and contact with aliens really works, he prompts his fans to make art and magic as one wholly colorful process, something Moore would agree with after one has assimilated a handful of his less grumpy interviews in one sitting. The Mars Volta attempted a similar working with their album Bedlam and Goliath, though the argument can be made also for their live album Scab Dates. After they acquired a haunted instrument from a South American flea market, which influenced the concept album as well as their personal lives, not unlike Morrison's experiences. Tool used to have some clues to their magical adventurings journaled on their website Toolband or Tool Shed, with other clues to their esoteric pursuits scattered throughout their interactive puzzle website Dissectional and Danny Carey's official website. These adventures usually involve the René Le Chaton or Area 51, ritual, tools, jams, and one narrative, authored by magician and close friend of the band allowed in their inner circle, Blair Mackenzie. Discordianism, geocaching, cryptic internet puzzles such as Cicada 3301, and secret societies all meet in the ideas put forth in the Jejune Institute and the documentary about its players. The Institute where an echelon-like organization guides players around the world to solve puzzles and perform public acts of eccentric, flash mob-like weirdness to gain access to higher tiers of the organization and on to bigger, more cryptic sets of puzzles. The Institute is quite close to our closely studied hypersigil, made of cryptic puzzles gaining momentum in our fields of study recently. Hellier. There's also a nearly impossible veil to discern the difference between predictive programming and those intuitively picking up precog information about the future of our world through mass pulp production in various mediums like comic books and music. Colin, when you first read The Invisibles, how did it impact you personally or magically, however you choose to take that?
Yeah, well, it was I guess in your life you have certain things that have a sort of cultural impact on you. And I remember getting the first issue of The Invisibles mail order from the Forbidden Planet shop in a little brown envelope in 1994, which is kind of a key year for me. I mean, what was I, 15 at the time? So probably I was the right time to discover something like that. As someone who, as a kid, I was one of those people who'd read all of the books from the library about UFOs and aliens and the paranormal. So that was always something I was fascinated by. Anyway, and then something like Invisibles comes along and it sort of hits you with a lot of stuff, it's a very metatextual work, The Invisibles, and it is a lot of tendrils that reach out from it and a lot of reference points. So, I mean, initially, I think I read that. I think I got the first four issues, which kind of is the opening arc. And then soon after that, I got maybe a year or so after that, I got the whole first volume and read that. And at the time, I was reading a lot of comics anyway. I was kind of into comics, and particularly, I mean, The Invisibles. Firstly, it's part of the so-called British invasion that happened in American comics in the late '80s, going into the '90s, with people like obviously Alan Moore was kind of the start of that. With Watchmen, but that sort of opened the floodgates to people like Neil Gaiman, Peter Milligan, and sort of writing about stuff that wasn't common in American superhero comics, which at the time were seen as largely disposable pop art form, which you were sort of alluding to there in your intro. Something that was just sort of childish entertainment for kids, which Alan Moore still thinks it is. But yeah, I mean, The Invisibles, there's so much that Morrison pulls into it. There is ufology, there is situationism, culture jamming, there is anarchism, even just the artwork of that first issue, which was originally designed by Reid and Hughes, I think, and the logo, which it's very much calling back to the Sex Pistols, anarchy in the UK, that sort of, that sort of cut up. There's Dada, there's all these things, these sort of countercultural things coming in there. It's a grenade. It's a pop art grenade. It's a colorful, cool hyper grenade, and it's the bomb, which is another key conceptual thing that there is running all the way through The Invisibles, which is this, the concept of nuclear war. And Morrison, as a child, I believe his father was involved in, protesting against, protesting towards nuclear disarmament. And that's something that had a big influence on him as a creator going into it.
And also his dad would play ball with him by the fence of this highly top secret facility where they kept or worked on nukes in the UK. I'm not really sure what base it was. And so Morrison's father would fake accidentally throwing the ball over the fence so they could both hop over the fence and get a little gleam of whatever they could see before they ran back to where they were initially playing. And Morrison would see little men on little one-man carts and things driving around tunnels and Austin Powers sort of visuals. And I always thought that was interesting. But he surely always remarks on how much that had an effect on not only him, but the whole culture was expected to swallow. That at any moment, you might have to get under your desk because nuclear obliteration is going to happen any minute.
Just briefly before other people want to say things, I mean, my mother told me some stories about, it was actually during the Cuban Missile Crisis. She had to go and do some sort of war training thing
Hmm.
where she was running around. They took my mum in a bus and they blacked out the windows so she didn't know where she was going. And then they were doing some sort of war sort of recreation thing where there was people running around on rooftops with fake guns, and this was somewhere in Scotland in within the 60s. It's just, that was weird. She never quite told me the full story of that. It's quite an odd tale.
We know that blacked out bus
Yeah.
idea from ufology in Area
Mm.
51, where supposedly the employees of these companies working on secret things or privatized military companies, technology companies, they have blacked out buses. And what I've heard most recently is that they have to wear some sort of glasses that essentially make blinders of your peripheral vision so you can only see directly in front of you and what you're working on. That's the most extreme version of we can't sit in the cafeteria at lunchtime with anyone else working on another part of the plane or another part of the engine.
Yeah.
So it's so compartmentalized that you're working on this one little piece. It's absolutely forbidden to communicate with anyone, and they will find out if you just have a casual phone conversation with someone and let something drop, because those people are persecuted, I guess you could say appropriately in their eyes. But I think it's very interesting how, just going back to what's in the Invisibles and what there is to unpack there, when people talk about the major shift in comic books in the 80s and 90s, and they talk about the British invasion shifting the landscape, I think to people not really familiar with comics, that seems cliche. That seems like what happened was these guys came from Britain and they had uh, whole new ideas for costumes and they had brave new ideas for stories. But they literally changed the landscape from, like you were saying, kind of disposable ideas that had already become quite redundant by the 60s and 70s of strong men in capes and space adventures with any given astronauts and amazing stories or whatever, to this thing that was a hybrid of all the culture that had come before it. So you have Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, and Warren Ellis all leading their own paths in comics, all trying to teach us and describe to us different parts of sort of a magic curriculum. And then what Alan Moore did with essentially destroying the superhero and trying to fully get into the head of the anti-hero or even the villain, and all at the same time, the sorts of things that happened in Watchmen and the sort of pure rebellious spirit that came out of V for Vendetta, I think is something Grant Morrison became obsessed with for the rest of his life. I think that what Alan Moore did with the characters in Watchmen was a game that Grant Morrison was trying to play with every single title he got after that. And then when we just get to Invisibles, particularly, I think that when you start reading it, there's all these parts of your fandom that start lighting up. You go, oh, I get that vintage comic book reference. I get that vintage pulp sci-fi reference. Oh, now he's talking about this magic book, that I feel like only me and 10 other people in the world might have read. That's astonishing that, oh, now he's bringing in this character that practices an entirely different form of magic that you can only find on one continent thousands of years ago. And then, oh, now he's getting into the UFO thing, but he's able to approach it in such a diverse way that it could be considered a Jacques Vallée, Terence McKenna plus nuts and bolts UFO thing, with Gnosticism riding all the while in the background, certainly leading the motivations of villains. And I don't think people get how layered Grant Morrison's work is, but Invisibles is by itself. And I don't think people understand. You mentioned Peter Milligan, how much the British invasion formed the entire cast of Vertigo comics, and how much Vertigo itself kept
Yeah.
pushing comics to be smarter, to be deeper, to be darker. But aside from all that, to challenge the art, we were finally looking at we had seen every type of way you can draw a guy in a cape flying around and doing giant things, but we hadn't seen worlds of the Fae, the Tuatha De Danann, illustrated entirely in watercolor. We hadn't seen mixed media taking on the form of the cover of every comic in an entire series, like Doom Patrol or Shade the Changing Man. And I think people really underestimate what the British invasion meant.
Yeah, you go back to like Neil Gaiman's books of magic, which I think, Frank, you've written some stuff about this here and there. I mean, that's a phenomenal series, and it's so. I mean, people have spoken. I mean, it's often said that the Gaiman, people have accused Gaiman of being a Scientologist or being an occultist or stuff like that. I think he's just a really great writer. Like the books of magic, which delves into the history of occultism, in beautiful watercolor art, or. And
Yeah,
yeah,
Books of Magic is astounding. I remember being in a flea market and seeing some all black book with like a talisman on it and and I was looking through comic books, but something in my head just goes, oh, this is some occult book. It's got some weird sigil thingy, some weird Solomon-like sigil on the cover, and it's all black. I absolutely need this. I don't have a lot of magic books. Whatever this is, I'm just going to get it because I'm in a flea market and things are priced this way. And I know this book's going to mean something to me. And then a few moments later, I realize that's a comic book. And then a few years later, I get the idea that there would be no Harry Potter. There would be
yeah,
no little brunette kid with giant glasses and, an all sidekick learning the different types of actual magic, whereas Harry Potter has a very soft, made up kind of, post pagan, half a Pokemon kind of way of understanding magic. Neil Gaiman was brave enough years before to put, I'm trying to remember the young man's name, the Tim Hunter,
Tim Hunter, yeah.
through all these different magical worlds with a different kind of like you have when you go in the underworld, you have the guy that drives the boat in the who drives the ferry, the guy you gotta pay a toll to or whatever. There's this kind of similar thing where there's a different character more knowledgeable about a certain level of the astral realm or a certain entire magical practice, and with that a psychological perspective. So you get the much darker, jaded, could be considered evil, cryptic kind of magic that you're learning from John Constantine as he goes through a pack of cigarettes a minute. And then you have the much more motherly, friendly Zatanna teaching you things about nature magic or the relationship between like Houdini stagecraft, practical magic and high magic, or Crowley with a K magic. I just thought that was all so brave for the time,
Yeah.
and looking back in the culture, all we have is Harry Potter to fill that space in pop culture.
Well, I was just going to mention, you brought up the character of John Constantine, who again was created by Alan Moore, who then never had anything to do with him again after introducing him in Swamp Thing. But when I was a teenager, in the formative years, I remember getting a whole ton of the Hellblazer comics, written at the time by Garth Ennis and Paul Jenkins as well. I mean, that was a again, Constantine back then was painted. I mean, he's a generic sort of a character, you could say. He's like a classic occult investigator. He's like an M.R. James character almost. He's just a guy who deals with the supernatural. There's almost something slightly Holmesian about him. But at the same time, you had those stories in the late 80s where specifically, I mean, it was Jamie Delano actually, who was the first writer of the Constantine series, who was painting him as very much a countercultural figure. He was railing against Thatcher and British Toryism in the late 80s, which was a bit of an odd thing to put into an American comic book. But, he was hanging out with travelers and gypsies, and dealing with nature magic and, the chaos magic. As a sort of a figure who was kind of just delving into a sort of, hidden stuff and occult stuff and supernatural stuff, and he was very much the reluctant hero, like a classical figure in a lot of fictional works, descending into the underworld and dealing with his darkness and his demons, like a flawed hero.
Sure, and correct
Uh,
me if I'm wrong, but every single one of the British invasion authors, certainly all the ones we just named, then started a tradition that only Jack Kirby had accomplished by this time. Jack Kirby being a personality very different from Morrison, which is passing these characters between them. I mentioned on the show before how Moore thought Constantine actually walked up to him at a bar, and he
Yeah.
did not follow when Constantine said to follow. But Morrison, Ellis, Moore, and Gaiman have all written Constantine, Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah,
Tim
with
Hunter's like,
I just mentioned Jamie Delano, who was the first writer of Hellblazer. Jamie Delano was from Alan Moore's hometown of Northampton. They were from the same town, and I think they had that connection. And I think Alan Moore recommended Jamie Delano to write the Hellblazer series when it was first being mooted.
okay.
Prior to Alan Moore obviously hating everybody in comics ever.
Right, right. But Jamie Delano then went on to write the Books of Fae, which was a Books of Magic sub-series,
Yeah,
right?
he
Yeah.
also wrote Animal Man. He wrote the
Yeah.
Animal Man series for quite a while after Grant Morrison had written it. So yeah,
Yeah.
there was a lot of crossover with those early people, with those sort of characters.
Stephen, were you about to say something before I
Yeah,
talk about
it
Constantine?
kind of occurred to me too, around this time frame you guys were talking about with the British invasion in comics, the 80s, the early 90s, and therefore so forth. I think this would also be around the same time that Clive Barker's works were really starting to gain a lot of
Yes,
traction,
Barker.
especially here in the
Yes.
States. And I mean, he really, I think, in a lot of ways also upended the horror genre because, I mean, in the States, a lot of this had really been defined by Stephen King since the mid to the late 70s. And as I think King kind of famously described his work, it was about the equivalent of a Big Mac and fries. I mean, that's, not to say that there aren't some interesting synchronicities and so forth in King's work, but Barker definitely, I would say, had a very keen interest in the occult, very serious approach to this, which he was really able to bring into some of his works, especially some of the more fantasy-oriented ones, like the Imagino series?
In Magica.
Magica, yes. Weave World, a lot of this kind of stuff, and The Great and the Secret Show, and so forth. And it occurred to me too, there's really a lot of similar. I mean, I'm not super familiar with Constantine. I'm not really a big comic book reader, but from the way Frank has described him to him and so forth, it does seem like there's a certain degree of overlap with a character that Barker would use on several occasions called Harry D'Amour,
Yes. Yeah.
who was
Yeah.
a private detective who would also kind of get into the investigations of a lot of, fringe topics, the paranormal and so forth. Of course, D'Amour was featured in the Lord of Illusions film that Barker did in the mid '90s. He was played by Scott Bakula of Quantum Leap, actually. So it does kind of seem like there was like a bit of this, same zeitgeist that was playing out in, horror literary genre as well at the same time as this was going on in the comic books.
And it seems like there's a need to just kind of have a character by default who is in the place of these Lovecraft, Ronnie Howard kind of characters. Like, you just need someone to invest. You need a Mulder type. And since the Lovecraft types, I guess, were already sort of established, it was like these different writers were just finding something like Constantine to take the play in order to tell those larger stories. The point wasn't to have a guy who investigates stuff and he's going to be really interesting. It was more that you have these adventures you want to tell, so you need, somebody's perspective to start with. And it was safe to have, against the Lovecraftian backdrop of a creepy town or a scary monster, some sort of private investigator. Warren Ellis does this habitually, but he has an entire series called Gravel that just, I don't know how many comics are in the series, but many. It's an indie title where he basically just tells all these stories about, haunted places and weird Clive Barker like transdimensional demons coming to our own and whatever from the perspective of this private investigator.
It is really fascinating how that seems to have become such a trope around the late 80s, early 90s. Of course, the Dresden. I've never really read the Dresden Files, but I'm under the impression that that's kind of a similar setup. And then, at least in terms of a movie that's very dear to my heart, that would be John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, which came out I think in 95, 96, and that's another one where you've got a private detective played by Sam Neill who's investigating the disappearance of a Lovecraft / Stephen King like author. And even though it's not technically based on a Lovecraft work, I would say In the Mouth of Madness is probably the greatest Lovecraftian adaptation of anything ever done. It's really a remarkable movie, and increasingly more and more relevant by the day, I would say, which is rather disturbing.
Yeah, the title is nearly At the Mountains of Madness, isn't it? It's very close to an unofficial Lovecraftian adaptation.
Yeah, definitely.
And even, sorry, I was just going to say with regards to Clive Barker, I mean, his first novel, Cabal, which became the movie Nightbreed, is such a fascinating film about, subterranean people that live underground, and sort of they're referred to as the tribes of the moon. And they're these sort of supernatural mutant people that live underground and have been hidden from and been rejected by society, and they live underneath a graveyard. So there's a lot of real sort of unconscious sort of stuff in Barker's work that's to do with alternate universes and dream-like realities.
Well, it's also interesting too, because they were, the main characters essentially, which was another real innovation of his. I mean, typically, I think there was the one human character who gradually became one of their tribe or something like that. But I mean, it's a very favorable depiction of them. Whereas, and historically in these types of stories, they would have just been kind of one-dimensional villains. And under Barker's guidance, I mean, they're fleshed out. They're given, dynamics and so forth, and they're ultimately kind of the protagonists of the story, which was certainly a major innovation. And that's something that Barker really would continue, this kind of sympathetic depiction of, these strange creatures and so forth.
I was always really amused with Barker's work, like early in life. And when we started the whole sync thing with me, Colin, Violator, Trevor, and Peter, there was a lot of work we did around the idea of that cube. One of Jim Henson's first films was called The Cube, and it seemed to have a lot of metaphysical sort of clues in it. Then there's the Hellraiser cube, which brings you in another dimension to be assimilated by the Cenobites. Then there's the Borg cube, and they literally turn everything into Borg and computers in a much more direct assimilation. And then there's the Allspark cube, which gives the power to the Transformers in the Transformers films. And there's a cube in Aqua Teen Hunger Force and a cube in G.I. Joe, and on and on. And so we pooled all these ideas together, and so I thought Barker was on to something with that. And then I learned about Midnight Meat Train, which was a film that he produced or had something to do with, but essentially there's
I believe it was based on a short story that he had written earlier that was in one of the Books of Blood, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the Midnight Meat Train. It's quite reminiscent of the British 70s film Death Train, which I think has Death Train. I think is an alternate title, but it's about sort of killers on the London Underground, and I think the Midnight Meat Train is kind of similar to that. And it's the descent into the underworld. It's that classical thing of going beneath the earth and discovering trials and tribulations.
But there's reptilians who feed on people and make mountains of their bones, and then the guy who drives a seemingly inhuman character who drives these people to their inevitable doom with the reptilian beings has an 8-pointed star, like a star of Ishtar.
All right. See, I don't think I've actually read the original story, but the actual movie is kind of more of a generic sort of serial killer type movie, I think.
We're talking about two different movies.
Oh wait, sorry, I was talking about the Midnight Meat Train.
Yeah, Midnight Meat Train has actual reptilian entities in it. But you were talking about a earlier film from the UK. Did I get confused? I'm sorry.
Oh no, Death Train. I
Death
was
Train.
thinking, no, I think Midnight Meat Train. Maybe it's been a long time since I've seen it, so I can't quite remember.
This is like a 2007 film.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, just make sure. I'm sorry. I might have made that confusing, but that got my curiosity up because he actually included reptilians that lived underground that they were sacrificing people to or whatever. And then my eyebrow really got raised toward Barker, so I picked up his video game Jericho, and in the first 5 minutes, you're introduced to Crowley and a British OSS officer, and Crowley has made this kind of trans-dimensional baby entity that's following you around, and you're stuck in this other dimension filled with Clive Barker-esque monsters. And it's all in all, it's a cult World War II plot that they then forced a shooter game in between, or at least Clive Barker had great ideas about a World War II occult plot, and then it was translated to this kind of below average shooting game. But all the characters that you're playing as, the actual shooters or whatever, it's like a 4-man team, and each one is like a cult special forces in some way. So one character can astral travel, and one character can heal, and one character can like bilocate or whatever. So you can choose between using everyday military weaponry or occult forces to fight these monsters. And then once I just played the first 20 minutes of that, I realized Barker was actually a lot deeper than I had ever given him credit for.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the one, Colin, what was it called again? The one that start with an I, magic?
Imagica, which was that's a
Imagica.
gigantic sort of 1400
Yeah,
page novel that he wrote. That's
I think
completely out there.
I think it was originally two separate
Yeah, I
novels.
think
But I
so.
mean,
I think yeah.
but I mean, it's really just a fabulous account of Gnosticism, really. I mean, I think that was really what he based it upon, and the rise of the patriarchy, and then essentially a return of the matriarchy and so forth. I mean, definitely some very, very high esoteric concepts that were incorporated into what was, you know, really a fabulous fantasy novel as well.
So,
So slightly related to that as well in terms of writers who can channel stuff. I was sort of thinking that in the same context of because I've been rereading a lot of early Whitley Strieber novels, and I read Cat Magic, which is another novel with magic in the title, and that's a really interesting book because it originally Strieber credited a co-writer who he claimed was an occultist and a Wiccan, who was his consultant on the novel, who sort of added the stuff about magic, because it's about a small town where there's a conflict between pagans, Wiccans, and sort of a Christian hierarchy that is in charge of the town. And Strieber credited this pagan, and there was no pagan, it was just Strieber. And this was prior. This was about a year before Strieber came out with his contact experiences and published Communion. So I think Cat Magic was published in, I think, 1986, and I think Communion came out in 1987, I believe. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really deep occult stuff in that novel Cat Magic, if people want to check that out if they haven't read it before, to do with the afterlife and transition to another realm. Like Strieber's most recent book is A New World, where he's talking about how he believes, essentially, throughout his whole contact experience, that the visitors, the beings that he's encountered, have been perhaps dead people, or what happens to us after we die. So that's another interesting thing in terms of writers being able to channel something, you know, in a fictional framework, in a throwaway sort of horror novel, telling us all this uncanny stuff about the afterlife and other realms.
yeah, I need to check that out. That's very interesting.
I'm always interested in anything that's called cat magic. So
one word, Cat Magic. Yeah.
okay.
That draws me in as well, of course. We're all obsessed with kitties over here.
Cats, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. No,
Cats and magic.
So one of the really interesting things that I find Warren Ellis primarily putting into his plots is these characters who can sort of re-energize or utilize the ley lines in whatever place they're from or place they genetically hold magic, so to speak, to either open up magical doorways or sort of protect an area. In Warren Ellis's it's not most recent, but it's a year or two ago, Injection title, he has very much like a bizarre outdoorsy Mulder and a scientific sort of crippled Scully. And they go into these Terence McKenna sort of psychedelic, plant-based consciousness realms. But then the male character also explains as he's walking up to like some ancient stones in Scotland or Ireland or something, the way to kind of tap into those energy fields. And it's something he brings into the stories a lot, as I was saying. Planetary, which is another graphic novel I would suggest to anyone. If you're listening and you get anything from this show, it's please check out Invisibles and Promethea if you haven't, with Planetary riding shortly behind those. Planetary much more concerned with sort of time archaeologists or people that travel all over the world and through time to sort of uncover and explain and utilize the exotic energy systems from different paranormal events. It's a bit hard to explain, but Grant Morrison gets into this in his Batman Gothic series, which way before any of this was in the news. It's got this kind of satanic panic pedophile ring thing going on where there are children being abused in the bottom of this, in the basement of this church. Now, since it's the basement and the way Catholic churches have always been built, all the singing and all the talking and the mantras toward Jesus and God and so forth swirl upward as sound waves in the architecture, and the architecture is built a particular way to make all the energy move into sort of an upward spiral toward God. In World War II, soldiers said that they could whisper to one side of the catacombs or one side of the church, and it would cross over the entire ceiling of the church, and a soldier on the other side could hear them. But if there was a soldier in the middle or the doorway, they would hear nothing because the sound would just travel up and over. So Grant Morrison's idea here is that you can invert the energy of the church, if you picture the building like a cathedral as fitting into a pentagram, and you turn that star upside down, and the top of the star is now slightly below the actual ground. So in the basement and under the cathedral or church is where you could invert all the energy for satanic black magic reasons. And so these priests have concocted themselves these odd machines that hold and torture children as they're doing whatever rituals to them and things like that. And so yeah.
Sorry, I'm cutting in there.
No.
I can't say I've read a ton of Warren Ellis's stuff, but I think the Gothic series by Grant Morrison, the Batman story, which was originally in Legends of the Dark Knight, that's a really interesting story, and it sort of seeds a lot of stuff that Morrison would write about later, particularly with regards to that whole thing of elite, even pedophile abuse. It's funny because you see a lot of that in the Illuminati, MK Ultra stuff, which you see a lot in early Invisibles, and that is uncanny. He clearly had been doing his research and reading a lot of stuff with regards to. I mean, today we can look at Jeffrey Epstein, or even the stuff with Prince Andrew at the moment, with the British monarchy being wrapped up in all sorts of weird stuff. Megxit, I mean, there are the death of Princess Diana, which gets referenced. I think in the Invisibles he references like some sort of thing to do with the death of Diana prior to it happening, I think. Yeah, there's a lot of that seeded in there. Yeah.
I mean, if you just look at the beginning of, I thought I had it close enough to me to tell you, but the beginning of, I think, of volume 3 of the Invisibles, basically when they break into the Dulce.
Oh yeah, he'd clearly read the Dulce papers at that point. Yeah, in the early 90s.
He read everything about Dulce based. So it's like, I've read a lot about underground bases and about the alien interaction with these military installations, and particularly about Dulcie under the Arcoleta Mesa or whatever.
Like William Cooper's Behold the Pale Horse, I think as well. There's a lot of that in there, and that fed into the X-Files a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, if you just consider, I mean, there's a lot of X-Files crossover, but if you
Yeah.
just consider how many ideas he packed into what he was just sort of suspecting would be in the Dulcie base. So there's the cure for
Magic Mirror, yeah, yeah.
there's a cure
The
for
Roswell
AIDS.
trash, yeah.
There's a bizarre alien that we've never pictured or seen in popular culture related to the Roswell crash. There's the technology from various other crashes. There's, mind control freaks that are other species of little gnome-like beings that apparently also came as a byproduct of UFO crashes. There's military leaders who are taken over by an archonic black oil like substance, like Spider-Man's suit or Venom's suit or the X-Files black oil or any one of those comparisons you want to make. When the human general isn't doing the job correctly, isn't being severe enough, the alien will sort of visually possess his body with this black oil, and he'll become this much more tyrannical, archonic entity than just an old military-industrial complex type. But that's just a few pages in
Yeah,
all
and
of,
then there's the whole time travel element in the Invisibles,
yeah,
which is
origami.
interesting because I think some of that is slightly borrowed from Doctor Who. I think Morrison obviously grew up in Doctor Who as well, old school
Yeah,
Doctor Who. The sort of the agents of the Archons are referred to as Cyphermen, which is a bit like Cybermen. And honestly, they're wearing like gas masks, which interestingly enough sort of relates to Sandman as well. They sort of look
yeah,
like the original Golden Age Sandman in that they
yeah.
wear gas masks, and that's a Second World War reference as well. Yeah, there's so much stuff going on there.
Yeah, it's really amazing to just break apart any. You could take that scene as well, where the guy who's essentially Morpheus is talking to the girl who's essentially Trinity, and they start talking back and forth in these weird like mnemonic MK Ultra breakdown codes, and then the girl realizes she's not in the 1930s holding a gun to this dude's face at all. She's like crying in a corner of some
Yeah.
medical laboratory because they're doing these kind of super soldier break open your mind and rebuild it with weird code terms you don't even understand kind of methodology. And it's just another example of packing so many ideas. Also another example of how influential Invisibles was. I mean, you can get the Matrix out
Yeah.
of that few other concepts, and you haven't even touched a tenth of the material in all the
Yeah,
volumes.
that's like a whole other story as to whether or not the Matrix films were very influenced by the Invisibles. I'm not sure, but there are, I mean, you can take in, I mean, you go back to Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus, which I think was a very big influence on the Invisibles, if you've read that. I mean, you have, that maybe influenced Morrison and that influenced the Matrix as well. But there's the scene, I think, in the original first Matrix film where Agent Smith, he's torturing Morpheus, and there's a speech that he gives that is sort of like, I can't remember exactly, but it's a sort of it's like a black
Compares
ivory
humans to a
prison.
virus or something like that.
Yeah, which is pretty much almost word for word taken from The Invisibles, but at the same time, the feel of it is very Philip K. Dick. It's very much
Yeah.
our reality is an illusion. It's the Plato's cave sort of conversation. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there is another Matrix movie on the way, which I'm quite excited to see what will happen with that. And there's allegedly an Invisibles TV series, which is sort of in the works, but whether that actually happens or not, I don't know. Because I think Grant Morrison has written a whole ton of stuff for TV, and he's written loads of movies that have never actually been made, probably because his stuff is too out there.
Yeah, and well, Global Frequency and Invisibles have both. Global Frequencies, a Warren Ellis book, have both been, talked about and whispered about a movie or a show coming out for at least a decade now. That I remember going back and seeing comic book news saying, maybe in a couple months, something. But I think that it comes down to like The Invisibles is inspired by 3,000 things, and then not many years later, The Matrix is certainly inspired by Invisibles, but some 5,000 things. And one of those things that I always bring up is the evolution of this weird set, the set that is in the film The Crow, where he's just running around this really, dark, broken up city, is the same set that they then used for Dark City. And even the same director and producer, David Goyer, was very intimately connected with that.
Yeah.
And the same set from The Crow and Dark City is then used in The Matrix. So The Matrix has so many influences and it's pulling from so many directions. I think people would just upset themselves if they sat there and really tried to think, okay, where did they directly get its ideas, plural, and many of them? The Sophia Stewart was convinced Terminator Matrix was all her work, so there's a lot of different ways to look at it.
That's a weird one, the Sophia Stewart story, if people want to look into that. Yeah, that
strange.
This woman who claims that she wrote a novel, which I don't think was ever actually published, or maybe it was self-published, in I think the late 80s, called The Third Eye, and she claimed it was essentially, it was the Terminator and the Matrix storylines that then were ripped off, and she's been trying to sort of push the story. I mean, it's odd. I might actually try and read that book one of these days just to see what the deal is.
Yeah, same here. I mean, she claims that she kind of came up with humans creating Skynet, and then Skynet became the machines from the Matrix, and that's all.
It's like a big crossover, yeah.
Right. But then one only has to think about that for a few seconds to be like, well, Skynet and things like that, and a lot of ideas in the Matrix were like purely Philip K. Dick's years before.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, a lot of it goes back to Philip K. Dick. You say the Matrix and the Invisibles, and even the Terminator. It's that sort of, we're living in a sort of a fictional reality, a Gnostic reality, whereby we're controlled by a creator god like Yaldabaoth or whatever. We're living in a sort of simulated simulacrum. I think the Wachowskis actually credited Baudrillard's book, Simulacrum, I think it is, that is talking about that. The whole sort of simulated video game reality thing.
Yeah, that's what Neo pulls the cash out of.
Yeah.
The scene where the girl with the rabbit tattoo and her strange punk friends come to invite him to the club or whatever. I don't really remember what that was in the film. He's in his apartment. It's one of the only scenes where he's in his apartment.
They were trying to get some kind of software from him or something like that. They gave him money for like a disc or something like that, if I remember correctly.
That's what was in the Simulacrum book. Yeah, you're right. So, moving into, should we wrap it up or should we keep going? What do you guys?
Wow, I mean, this has been interesting so far. Yeah,
certainly. Yeah.
I thought we were going to talk about like music as well, but maybe that's
what I was.
Maybe that's for another show.
I was going to say, should we move into music or should we just leave it for another show? The only other thing I was going to talk about was the Jejune Institute and the film The Institute being very much like Hellier, and how we're probably going to wind up talking about Hellier more. But you guys want to wrap this up and just safely fit the music into another one?
Why don't you go? Why don't you go into the Institute right quick here, and then we'll just do the music on another time.
Surely, yeah. So there's a movie right now which is free on Tubi, which you can get on Roku and Cox Digital. It's called The Institute. There's two films called The Institute. This one's the documentary, and it gets into this whole weird combination, like I was saying, between Discordianism and flash mobs and geocaching, and Cicada 3301 type online puzzles, whereby you solve these different puzzles and then it'll tell you to go to a certain city and wait by a payphone, and then you get a call on that payphone that tells you to go to a certain skyscraper and go to the 44th floor, and there'll be a VHS waiting for you in an empty office with a secretary who can't give you any answers about why you're there, and you sit down and watch this weird new age instructional video, and it leads you further on the quest. It's like Cicada 3301 in that it existed largely online in certain forms, and people from all over the world were coming together in teams to try to solve it. It's also believed that it possibly had to do with some sort of intelligence organization recruiting tool like Cicada 3301 is largely thought to be. But it's based around these weird new age kind of inspirational videos, motivational videos. It harkens back the kind of feeling around Essalon and SRI. And Beyond the Black Rainbow was largely inspired by, I think, the ideas at work in the Jejune Institute or the Institute, and the ideas that Val Valerian brings to the forefront, and how these things kind of cross over in this weird Cold War conspiracy space, a kind of extreme exotic conspiracy space that we kind of got to before, talking about William Cooper, Val Valerian, Commander X, and where all this material kind of meets. So, like Hellier, it seems that some intelligence brought together a bunch of ideas and steps and clues for other people to go do the footwork and the recording and the journalism of. Just like Hellier is, it's people being led from clue to clue. Some of them have multiple interpretations. You never really know if you're on the right path, but every once in a while you find a little more information that's not a red herring, and you start working with other people who have put together pieces of the puzzle to try to understand what the thing is. I realize I haven't described what the Institute or the Jejune Institute actually is, besides a process I gave an explanation of. And that's because I don't know. But just like in Hellier, you're collecting all these. So this is a much more new agey kind of puzzle atmosphere, whereas Hellier's all those elements but based around the paranormal and the occult. And these things are much like Tool's dissectional website that I mentioned. It's a bunch of seemingly unrelated, bizarre little articles on art and flash animations of human anatomy and alien facts. And you're just supposed to, you can progress further and further as you learn things and you decode things, but you don't really know what they're trying to tell you altogether. And you get the feeling that, just like with my 4811 website project, you get the feeling that the person's just trying to list a whole bunch of influences and give you a whole bunch of ideas and starting places for inspirations for your own magic or your own art. And then certain people get really, really into this, and they seem to think that the objective is to find the answer, get to a final solution. I didn't mean to say final solution, but get to a final answer as to what all these things mean in the same place. So I would suggest the Institute to anyone who liked Hellier. And I hope that I can get some of the people on this show to eventually get into the Institute. We can go back and forth in future shows and talk about the two, although we've hardly gotten many answers in Hellier, and I'm still very enchanted by Hellier's magic to, do a few more shows on that alone.
Yeah, I was only watching Hellier really recently because I hadn't actually seen it yet, and I was sort of unsure about it. And it was interesting to me, just on a side tangent, about how much sort of paranormal reality show television has changed, because it's a very slick sort of show. It's very sort of beautifully lit and filmed and dramatic. It's sort of, I was rewatching some of the original British Most Haunted series recently, which kind of was a show that I think it gave birth to a lot of those shows like Alien Hunters and those sort of silly kind of scripted shows where people go looking for aliens and they go looking for ghosts and they never actually find them.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting show. Absolutely, Hellier. Yeah.
The most interesting, but I think the most useful part is to show that Dana is constantly working and preparing spaces with some type of magic. One of the other
That's just right there in the first episode where she's doing a ritual, and they don't make a deal of it. She's just doing a ritual.
Yeah, and she'll explain every once in a while why she's doing what she's doing to prepare a space or something like that. But it's the combination of someone obsessed with codes and letters and numbers and language, someone who knows every single case about aliens and big feet and the goblins and etc., someone who has a magic background who can just kind of prepare and fight off anything that's coming from a realm that's not physical, and maybe someone a little more physical with it, like a military background or a martial arts background or whatever, in case you run into that kind of problem. And when you have the preparation with that kind of crew, you can do so much more than just go to a building, get permission to film for 4 hours, and run around scaring each other, knocking stuff over. I think that's the preposterous setup we see now with everything from Bigfoot hunters and stuff like that, like you were
Yeah, I,
saying.
I was thinking with those sorts of shows. I mean, what they're doing is they're creating a ghost. Like they go in there and someone comes with some historical information. Oh, apparently there's a ghost here, and it's the ghost of this person. And they're like, oh, it's Mister whatever. Like where I live in Edinburgh, there's you can go in the tours of the underground vaults, and there's a vault you can go down to, and there's apparently this guy, Mr. Boots, who is a noted misogynist. And this was covered in both the original British show and I think on one of the American shows. And the original episode, you see the people go down. Oh, Mr. Boots, he's a lot of trouble. He's gonna be grabbing the women. And they go down there and they're like, well, you've gone in there, you've invented this character who's down there, and then they're like, then they're reacting to this, fictional thing that they've made up, and it's so unreal. So at least with Hellier, you have something where they've sort of got away from that sort of scripted. You have to have a narrative that you build into the thing.
Yeah,
well, yes,
Go, Stephen. Sorry.
Well, I mean, yes, that's definitely, I think, one of the most refreshing things about Hellier, because I know, like, one of my first kind of paranormal hunt things, I was involved with this ghost hunting group in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, for a brief period of time. And it's like, they would go look through obituaries and stuff like that and try to find an area where somebody died suddenly. And we had found this one spot where this kid had driven his car into the river and had drowned and so forth. And they had been going there getting really good responses. And so I had gone on the internet and done a little sleuthing, and I had found the kid's MySpace page. And I had written down, about a dozen questions or something specifically related to things that had been on there. And so we start communicating, and I do think that the communication was legitimate, and start asking it questions about things that were on the MySpace page, and it knew nothing about that, nothing at all. And it just kind of occurred to me, okay, so this is something, I do genuinely believe that we're communicating with something, but it's obviously not what they think that it is. I mean, it knows absolutely nothing about this kid. And I do kind of think, like you're saying, I mean, that's, a lot of what happens in these types of ghost shows. You go to the spot where, you think that there's going to be a ghost of X or something like that. And I just think the psychic energy that the people are putting off summons something there that then starts masquerading as like whatever they're expecting to find there. Certainly, it's nice to see with Hellier that they're not, I would say that there is still quite a bit of gullibility from the crew in a lot of instances, but not, in that capacity at least.
Yeah, I mean the opposite of like doing a bunch of research and then safely and honorably and with respect invoking some type of entity or dead intelligence or whatever, and then attempting to commune with it. Like the opposite of that whole magical process we're familiar with is just running into a place you heard has some things going on, turning on a bunch of electric crap and saying, are you here? Can you hear me? Do you want to tell us something? We're going to be leaving in like 20 minutes. You want to say anything before we leave? And that's just the complete opposite of, and it is the half-ass way of trying to do that by saying, well, let's learn, whoever was murdered in an outrageous way in this place and then try to talk directly to them or whatever. But it's still going about it all the way wrong in my book. Whereas if you have a combination of sort of the naive and curious, okay, I'm going to walk this direction and just have the camera on in case something happens. And then the Dana element of, well, I'm going to do magic and safely try to commune with these entities and tell them we're not here to mess with them or hurt them or make fun of them or whatever. We're going to bring their favorite spices and tobacco and incense or whatever and see if they can show up and give us some kind of symptom that we're dealing with another intelligence. It just seems like completely opposing views, but it seems like one was a type of reality tunnel that would be allowed to go its course and destroy interest in the paranormal. You watch 10 different shows about ghost hunters going to the same mental asylum, and they don't catch anything at 45 minutes. And you're likely to walk away a year or two later thinking that maybe this whole ghost thing is just made up, because you've seen the shows, you've experienced it, you've seen where they've gone and seen it recorded for hours and nothing happened. And so that is, I think that has functioned successfully. So then everyone who still watches those shows is walking around saying, hey, have you seen Ghost Hunters? You whatever. And people are just like, yeah, I saw 100 episodes and literally nothing happened. I think that was all supposed to happen in culture, whereas Hellier completely destroys that and tells us to rely more on, heavy reading and critical thinking before we even decide to enter a space like that. But anyway, you guys want to wrap it up? I think that was a great show.
Yeah, excellent.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for listening in. And did anybody have any last things they wanted to add?
No, I think that's it.
I think we're good.
All right, you guys. Well, have a good night, and thank you guys for joining me.
All right, cheers.
All right,
Cheers.
bye-bye.